We have a lot of people here, and I know there's going to be a great deal of interest in questioning. We also have Assistant Secretary Posney here. Do you want to begin questions? No? We have the head. Okay. Let's go at it. What are the questions?
Are we looking to promote through national legislation to help states embrace these more robust models that are being suggested?
Bethany, do you want?
I'm not supposed to talk about money. I have an appropriations colleague who talks about money. But I will say, we spend billions of dollars on Title II right now, and I'm not sure we get a whole lot from that money. One of the sad things is we don't even know what we get from that money because we don't even ask how that money is really used and what we get out of it. So I do think there is a lot of money in this system that needs to be spent better, and I do think teacher evaluation, good systems of it, are a good place to spend it. But I also worry, somebody talked earlier about, this is one of my favorite statements of the morning, sometimes policy strays away from what we actually know. That was a understatement of the year. And I think it's often because people look for a magic bullet, and preferably a cheap one. And so we need to be really cognizant of the fact that this is, value added is not a magic bullet. Teacher evaluation is not a magic bullet, and it's certainly not a cheap one. And to the degree that people try to do this on the cheap, we will be doing a disservice to the policy, to the teachers, to the students.
Does anybody on the panel want to respond to what Bethany said or what the questioner said? Okay, go ahead. If you could identify yourself too, that would be helpful.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Dara Baldwin. I'm a policy analyst at NICL, National Council Independent Living. We're the longest cross-disability advocacy organization. And I want to say hello to the panel. Thank you. Thank you to you researchers for helping us be policymakers. We really need your work. My question is in reference to special ed. Thank you for mentioning it, Jesse, in your comments about it. And I'm glad to see that that's a part of it, the value added. But what about these services, the people around the special ed students, such as transitioning, Indicator 14, making sure they go off to college, graduate from high school, Indicator 2. So evaluating those people who assist, the VR people, the social workers, and that group. Where are they in this conversation? Thank you.
Certainly in the research on value added, they're nowhere. And I think a general view is that value added type methods are going to be completely useless for evaluating teachers who are teaching students who are much different at all from a typical student. Any sort of, it's not even, many students can't even take the tests. And if we can force them to fill out some bubbles, the results don't mean anything. And I think that we have to be serious about the fact that right now, about a third of teachers you can calculate value-added scores for. There's movements to expand testing so that you can do it for more teachers, but there are always going to be a lot of people in the schools and in the education system who we just can't use these methods to evaluate.
I think that the point that Jesse's making that kind of has multiple implications for this conversation is that to really understand outcomes, we need a range of very nuanced, thoughtful measures that are appropriate for different kinds of students and different kinds of contexts. Right now, we're not having that conversation about how to bring the range of evidence about outcomes in an integrated way into an analysis of, what schools are able to do and what individual teachers are able to do. Because right now, we're just using the specific tests that are inappropriate for a lot of students and are narrow even for the students who you can get some kind of measure on for them. And the bigger challenge is how do we both expand the range of measures and use them in ways that do not produce a situation where, for example, teachers who take on kids who are not likely to do as well on those measures in terms of gains are not given huge disincentives, and schools given huge disincentives to serve the kids. Because we already have that situation. We already have kids being pushed out of schools in the United States at very high rates. We already have teachers, avoiding schools which have high populations of kids with, certain kinds of challenges. And so, we don't want the teacher who is good with the squirmy boys to no longer be willing to take them, because once there's a value-added measure, it'll be clear that actually boys don't gain as fast in reading in the first few grades as girls do, particularly if they're squirmy. We need to be able to look at this in a much more nuanced way. And I think we should look to medicine a little bit more perhaps than we are doing right now. There has been a move in medicine as well to look at patient outcomes in terms of evaluating physicians. And there was a move very similar to the move in education to evaluate doctors based on mortality rates and to rank and sort them in that way. Of course, what that does is, create a disincentive to go into areas like AIDS treatment and an incentive to go into well baby care. It also creates a disincentive for cardiac surgeons, for example, to serve very sick patients. So they found out in New York when they ranked teachers or physicians on mortality rates that everyone's rates got better, but when they did a study, fewer very sick patients were being treated in New York. The ones who had money were being sent to the Cleveland Clinic and to Canada, and the ones who didn't have money were not getting treated because doctors were saying, if you have too many needs, I'm not taking you on for surgery. And that's the threat that we have for, students with special education needs and others, that teachers will start to say, I'm not taking, that teacher who's so good with all those kids who's taken them into her class year after year will say, I can't do that anymore.
Well, let me ask you this. What I meant by two different languages was that I hear the researchers say that there's all sorts of problems with value added. There's problems with including student test scores and teacher evaluations. There's all sorts of problems. But what I heard Bethany say was that I understand all your problems. There's deficiencies. There's reservations we have to have. But our policy mandate, our imperative, is to find some way to include student achievement in evaluating teachers, and because that's the most important thing. So what would you tell the Congress to do if they felt they had to include student achievement in evaluating teachers? How should they do it exactly?
Jesse wants to go first, and I'll add on.
What we learned from other fields where people aren't producing widgets, where the production process is complex, where the job has lots of different facets, there are commonalities about the way that people are evaluated. One is that you put a lot of resources into it. There are talks about rules of thumb that you have one full-time manager for every 5 or 6 workers. That we're nowhere near that in education. And those people, their job is just to do performance assessment and evaluation and feedback. Another rule of thumb is that you use this to provide feedback, and often you'll see that companies completely separate the compensation and retention decision from the evaluation process, because they don't want the evaluations to be corrupted by the incentives that are around high-stakes uses. Another is that any one measure doesn't get too much weight, and that you allow some subjective judgment to offset and to ignore the measure when it's clear that it's a flawed measure and not really indicative of true performance. All of those it's obvious how you could apply those to education, but none of those are really how we're doing it when we're pushing ahead with this.
Linda?
I would just add a couple points to that. I think we ought to be looking for multiple kinds of evidence of student learning and outcomes that are part of a portfolio of evidence that we look at with respect to teachers. So we would care whether teachers are, for example, helping kids transition, into the workplace, whether they're supporting, their movement towards graduation. We would care whether they can show learning on a variety of classroom assessments as well as on other external assessments. We would not let any one measure trump the rest of the decision-making process, which is, I think, the concern that's coming from the research community. In New York now, a teacher can't get tenure unless they show that they're in the effective band of the value-added scores. That trumps all the rest of the data. And there, too, as we see in the case in Houston, teachers who serve gifted and talented kids aren't showing growth. Those who serve new English learners and special education students. So we could just Get rid of all the teachers in the workforce who are teaching kids who are not well measured by tests, which, by the way, on No Child Left Behind, have been told to only measure grade level standards. So now we have tests all across the country that are only supposed to measure grade level standards, which means they don't measure much above the grade level, they don't measure much below the grade level, they don't measure growth on either side. So the point is that we need multiple measures of practice, what teachers are doing that we believe is well-founded, and multiple measures of learning and how that looks and for the kids that you have, with appropriate measures for those kids that get integrated in a combined analysis or assessment of what the teacher is doing and what the kids are learning.
It doesn't seem to be where the policy world is going. In Florida, isn't half the pay of teachers going to be determined by test scores now, by student achievement? And that's for this upcoming school year. What's going to happen in Florida? How are they going to measure?
Good teachers are going to leave teaching in Florida, I think.
Audrey?
And also, when you're looking, what Linda's talking about, this multiple indicators, the number one standard in our profession is to not use a test score as a sole indicator of anything. That's our number one standard. So if you look at these multiple indicators and you kind of look at maybe just the construct of teaching effectiveness that we're trying to capture, and right now we're relying on test scores to capture this, but you use multiple indicators, kind of like a pie chart, as different pieces of the pie. And like Jesse was talking about, with this equal weight, so one isn't going to trump the other. But theoretically, if we look at validity, what we call criterion or concurrent levels of validity, all of these things, if they're effectively capturing the teacher effectiveness construct, should be correlated. It's kind of like an inter-rater reliability, if you've ever heard of that, when you've got multiple people looking at an essay and you want to make sure that you have consistency. We are calling for like an inter-indicator reliability here. So if we have a teacher who's high value added, but the supervisor is like, no way, this teacher is not that great, we know that we have a problem with either one or possibly both of those indicators. And so we know that we have to put ourselves in check before we give them the check for merit pay. So it's really this construct, and all of these pieces need to correlate. Then we can actually validly say and reliably say, this is a good teacher, and maybe this isn't such a good teacher.
I saw a lot of hands now.
Hello, I'm Laurie Calvert, and I am a teacher in Asheville, North Carolina, and I'm here for 2 years, a temporary gig with Department of Education. I'm going back to teaching. I've just learned that I need to be very careful about which students are in my classes, and that's a sad thing. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, from a policy standpoint, what can we do to make sure that that non-value-added part is taken so much more seriously? I mean, I'm a 14-year veteran, and I've never had a serious evaluation. I've never had a principal spend much time in my classroom. I mean, more than 10 minutes, and I get all the high marks on the ratings, right? But nobody's ever there. And when I went to my state board and advocated for, got a chance to speak to them and advocated for principals being in the classroom so much more, I got a call from my superintendent who said, give me a break. When would we have time for that? Right? So I just feel like there needs to be some policy to incent principals knowing how to do evaluation, and principals or someone actually having the time, having their job description tied into taking that very seriously, because what they tend to do is they've built relationships with these teachers, and this teacher's kid may be babysitting their kid, and they don't want to put a bad evaluation on anything, and it's really just all drive-by.
Ed, did you want to say something?
Thanks, Jack. I was going to comment on the previous point, but part of what I say may be responsive to this as well. The problem was how to incorporate the value-added or some kind of evidence about student achievement in teacher evaluation. And the first thing that I think we need, responding to some of what Linda said, is better evidence of other kinds to supplement. It doesn't do any good to say value-added is only going to be 20% or 50% or X percent if the other percentage really isn't there. Because the measure that we have is a hard, or at least a perceptible number, is going to end up carrying a lot more weight and may even end up driving what the other numbers look like. So the first thing is to have more of those kinds of systems. The second thing that we need is policy that's sensitive to the complexity of combining different sources of information. I remember a conversation with a newspaper reporter who was pushing me for, should it be 20%, should it be 50%? I finally just said, what's the right percentage weight to give to biased information? You don't think about it that way. I would be the first person to say that a principal should have access to a teacher's value-added scores, and if a teacher has low scores year after year, that principal absolutely should know about it and should have a chance to look hard at what's going on and see whether some kind of corrective action is needed or not. Possibly the scores could be used as a trigger, but there has to be some more nuanced way of bringing that information into a dialogue with other sources of information that are more robust to come up with a wise policy.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm Geraldine Robbins, and I'm the teacher of the Squirmy Boys.
Thank you.
I too am squirmy. I have a question about what appears to be a disconnect between our general assessment and evaluation and the boots on the ground evaluation. What I just heard from the gentleman on the very end is that the principals should have access to these value-added scores so that they have some idea of the assessment of their teachers. One might argue if the principal were to walk into the classroom without the value-added scores in his or her hands, he or she would more than likely have an idea of the effectiveness or of the quality of that teacher, the quality of the learning that's going on. I think that that's an elephant in the room that we're not talking about, because we have obligations. We as teachers have obligations to assess our students' learning. Our administrators have obligations to assess our performance on the job. If they're not doing the work, it seems like it keeps rolling higher and higher, and then I picture this huge umbrella of generacy, and that's not even a word, but I'm mathematics, so I can make up words as I go along. That then we spend lots of time trying to make specific. It's a comment more than a question, but I think we have a hole that needs to be discussed.
Any comments? Yes, sir. Is there a mic? Yeah.
My name is Pat Welsh. I'm teaching at T.C. Williams High School in Alexandria.
And writes for the Washington Post every now and then.
Once in a while. But I think if you're going to get practical, I mean, teachers do want to improve, but you've got people coming into your room with the checklist mentality, and what they're trying to do is cover themselves for their superior, who's trying to cover them, or herself or himself for the superintendent, and you get a sense that they're not really trying to help you. It's kind of a cover-your-ass mentality. The problem with teaching is mediocrity. So you're not going to get rid of a lot of people unless you're willing to go to the mat in enormous lawsuits. But what you've got to do is have people coming into the room that teachers trust and that make teachers feel, oh, well, you've got somebody to tell me I really want to learn. As it is now, the only way teachers are really learning, at least what I've learned, is being with other teachers, being an AP reader with 400 English teachers and talking at night with them. But the evaluation as it is now, a lot of it is just checklist mentality. And one other thing I wanted to say, I read Steve Brill's book, Class Warfare. And after hearing Linda, I've been a big fan of Linda for years. It's so discouraging that the Obama people, John Schnur and others, tried to keep Linda out of a lot of the policy making and a lot of the discussions, and they've done so to their detriment. That's my last comment.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
I want to get back to that teacher's
Can we
comment.
go to this lady?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
There's a
okay.
mic in the back.
Go ahead.
Hello, Charles McCullough, Embassy of Australia. Since Secretary Duncan convened the first International Teaching Summit for the teaching profession in March of this year, there's been a larger focus on the multiplicity of teaching reforms happening in other countries, not just looking at what the latest PISA findings are. I know in Australia we've just launched our own teaching standards and principal standards and integrated those into PD, but I'm wondering, can anyone on the panel speak to teacher evaluation systems in other countries which may help to inform policymakers or evaluation system designers here in the United States? Thank you.
Linda's done work in that area.
I'm glad you brought up the international context. I just got back from Finland, which makes you want to eat your heart out, really, when you see the way they support teachers and kids in schools. And, you know, there's so much emphasis on investing in the knowledge base and the expertise of teachers before they come into the profession, in their, you know, master's degree programs that they take in teacher training schools connected to universities, et cetera, that the reflective capacity of teachers to be able to continue to improve their own practice and improve their colleagues' practice is kind of built into that process. And I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is that we put almost no resources into teacher training on the front end. We don't support the programs to get better. We don't support the teachers to be able to take advantage of good programs. And we can't fire our way to Finland. We can't just say we're going to get rid of teachers. Patrick said mediocrity was the problem. That's not because any teachers want to be mediocre. It's because we deny access to knowledge and skills to teachers through our whole set of policies that neglect that part of the process. But Singapore is a better example of the teacher evaluation process that we're talking about here, after people are in the classroom. Principals and lead and mentor teachers who are part of a career ladder there are all part of an evaluation process. It's regular, it gives continuous feedback, much like the teacher advancement program and some others that have been mentioned here. It focuses on, can you teach the whole child, mentally, spiritually, cognitively, physically, ethically. I mean, it's got a very broad view. It looks at whether teachers use expert practices in the classroom. It looks at evidence of student learning that is classroom-based. It does not use test scores. It looks at leadership capacity and develops teachers as leaders and puts them on the path towards other career growth. And it looks especially at whether teachers collaborate well together and contribute to the improvement of the entire school. And there's a lot of evidence that teachers' collective action in teams and in school-wide improvement has a bigger influence on school, on student achievement gains than any individual teachers. So they emphasize teachers as a member of a collective in the evaluation process. So I do think that we can look abroad. When Singapore was represented at that International Teachers Summit, the minister was very clear to say, we do not rank teachers. We do not rank them against each other. We don't use test score data to do that. We think it would be counterproductive. But we do pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the classroom for individual teachers and how they work collaboratively with each other. And of course, Singapore and Finland are two of the highest scoring jurisdictions in the world.
I read a McKinsey company report that said that Singapore only takes teachers from the top third of college graduates, and that in the United States it's 23%, and in poor schools it's a lower percentage. And so we're drawing from a different student body, I think.
Can I say something about
Sure.
that? Because there's conventional wisdom that comes around. Singapore's statistic was that they take from the top third of the high school class. In the United States, ETS did some studies about the test scores of people who actually make it all the way through a teacher ed program and go into the field. Most teachers come from the top half of the college class. The top half of, and the college class is about the top half of the high school class. So most teachers, particularly secondary teachers, come from the top quarter of their high school class as compared to the top third in Singapore. Now, you could also say that their high school students, do better on international assessments on average than ours do, especially in math, but there's I think, misinformation about the ability level of the American teaching force, which comes about in part because some studies look at who says in high school they'd like to be a teacher based on their SAT scores, not who actually gets into a preparation program, gets out of a preparation program, passes the licensing test. And there aren't as big a difference in the capacities of American teachers with respect to international teachers as one might think from some of the rhetoric that circulates.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Mary Beth Klotz, and I'm representing the National Association of School Psychologists. And my question is, I would like to ask the panel if anyone would express an opinion or have a comment about applying these value-added measures to specialized instructional support personnel, such as school psychologists, school social workers, school counselors. There are some states that are already doing this, so I'd appreciate hearing a comment on that. Thank you.
Jesse?
I mean, I don't know anything about the details, but it strikes me as a pretty terrible idea. For one thing, the idea that the main goal of a school psychologist is to raise students' test scores just strikes me as misguided. A lot of what schools produce is not reading and math test scores, and a lot of what we want schools to produce is not reading and math test scores. And it seems quite likely to me that the main things that the school psychologist is accomplishing are not reading and math test scores. And if we start evaluating them based on reading and math test scores, they're going to start working on reading and math test scores and ignoring everything else.
Another question? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ryan Miller. I'm a doctoral candidate at Florida State University in public policy. And my question actually stems from a comment. The thermometer analogy that was given, I found to be interesting, but it sounds like the concern of the panel is more not when the thermometer reads 101.7 versus 101.2, but 101.7 and 96.9. My question then stems from that. Could the use of confidence intervals rather than the point estimates for the teacher, how would that impact the validity of these measures in a teacher accountability system?
One study that I don't think we talked about that Sean Corcoran did in New York City looked at what the confidence interval is around a teacher's value-added score. And his a quick summary of what he found is that a teacher who's sort of at the 43rd percentile, kind of in the average range on a value-added effectiveness score, using the model that's being used in New York City, actually has an actual score somewhere between the 15th percentile and the 75th percentile. So the confidence interval is, the band is extremely large. And the bouncing around that we were talking about when Audrey was giving examples of individual teachers, you're right, it's not between 101.7 and 101.2. It's between sort of, 2 standard deviations above the mean to 1 standard deviation below the mean to back up to another standard deviation. I mean, it's huge variability from year to year that the examples that were being given suggest. So thank you for.
I think Ed has a comment to add.
Interesting question and a good concept. You'll recall I drew a distinction between bias and precision. Imprecision is the sort of random inaccuracy, the noise. That's what we could do a good job of getting at using confidence intervals. And if we just use more data, the confidence interval will shrink. But the more serious concern is bias, the fact that there's factors that aren't really random, that are going to lean against one teacher or for another, that cut across students, across classes. Interestingly, that problem is even worse at the school level than it is at the teacher level, since that's another use of these models that's being considered and hasn't been talked about. The intuition would be that with the larger samples at the school level, these models might work better because the confidence intervals would be smaller. But in fact, and I'm going to get technical for just a second since you're a doctoral candidate, the way that the value-added models identify the teacher effects is through the mixing of students as they're assigned to one teacher after another across years. The way that these value-added models would identify school-level effects would be that kids would have to move from school to school over the years. In fact, there is a fair amount of student mobility, but usually when students change schools, they move into other schools that are about like the schools that they've left with respect to socioeconomic status and so forth. As a result, there's really much less mixing at the school level than there is at the teacher level, and the bias problems are at least as severe for school-level uses of these models, even though the precision looks better.
This lady deserves an opportunity, given her persistence.
Thank you. My name is Shelley Hines. I teach physics and astronomy at the Louisiana School for Math, Science, and the Arts, and I'm an Albert Einstein Fellow. And my question has to do with student evaluations. Can you elaborate on how student evaluations can be fairly and effectively incorporated into teacher evaluations and how much weight they should be given? And this is kind of related to the idea of turning teacher preparation upside down, which to me implies a more college professor preparation. And college professors are evaluated heavily on student evaluations. Thank you.
Ed?
This is something, years ago, my first serious foray into teacher evaluation was back in the late 80s when I was working with Lee Schulman on some of the pilots that led later on to the national board evaluations, at least the earlier versions before the whole system went to ETS. We looked at high school students' evaluations of sample teaching as a source of possible information. Out of that, the conclusion that I came to is that students at the high school level are not terribly well positioned to be able to make sense of whether the teaching is good or bad. I think at the elementary school level, it would be even less so. College students have a better perspective because they've had more years of experience moving from classroom to classroom and having a larger set of teachers that they can compare to each other. But if I think about say a fourth or fifth grader trying to evaluate his or her own teacher, I'm not sure whether the sources of information that are going to go into that evaluation are going to be the right ones for a more sort of adult interpretation. Clearly, if all the children in the classroom are very unhappy, that's a problem. But that's something we should be able to get at in other ways. It might be better to focus on getting student input through measures of classroom climate, having kids answer questions about whether they feel comfortable asking questions, whether the kids in this classroom all learn together, whether there are opportunities to cooperate, whether they understand what the purpose of the schooling is, and so on. And out of responses to those kinds of questions, we might get better information to factor into the teacher evaluation.
Yes.
I'm sorry. And I think that is something that's forthcoming across states as the policy trickles down and they're trying to negotiate how this works. I know of a couple of states that are looking at student evaluations, given the issues, especially with early childhood evaluations of their teachers, but they're also looking at parent evaluations of teachers and also what's called 360 evaluations. They're using those with administrators. And so the teachers are now evaluating, well, in pilot projects right now, the teachers evaluating the administrators peers evaluating the administrators, and then the supervisors. So 360 evaluations are coming forth too. But it's again to add that all the indicators have issues themselves, but when you put it all together, theoretically, if they match, then you have a better capturing of the construct.
Let me use the student evaluations to emphasize two of the points I made. One is the Campbells Law Point. When I was a 13-year-old, I knew pretty well which teachers I liked and didn't like, and if you'd asked me, I probably would have told you. On the other hand, if you'd told me that the teachers are going to be fired or paid based on that, I'm sure I would have gotten a lot less homework that year. I would have, if the teachers need to get good evaluations, you don't want to ask adolescents to give them control over their teachers' careers unless you really want the teachers to be kowtowing to those adolescents, which probably isn't what we want the teachers to be doing. A second thing related to that gets at the short-term versus long-term. In retrospect, some of the teachers who I liked the most, I think probably weren't all that effective. They were a lot of fun to have as teachers. I would have given them very high evaluations, but I don't know that I learned a whole lot in their classes. And there were teachers who I didn't really like because they worked me too hard, who probably were very effective. And I think, again, these short-term measures, we've got to be very careful about them because it's not clear that they correspond very, very well to who's producing long-term benefits.
We have 5 more minutes, so unfortunately, we can only have a couple more questions. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Hi, I'm David Schlein. I'm an economist at the National Education Association. Given the reality that throughout states, we are seeing that 50% threshold, not just in Florida and the DC, but spreading like wildfire, and even some of the evaluation programs that you seem to like TAP, have a value-added component of at least 25%. What suggestions, practical suggestions, would you suggest be included in programs as safeguards? Anything that we negotiate or we try to advocate for as appropriate safeguards to ameliorate the bad things that come from value added?
Well, I think the panel talked about this earlier, about multiple measures and not having one measure trump another measure. Anything you care to add to that, Ed?
Robust appeals process, ways of combining evidence that aren't locked into some very mechanistic formula so that information can be evaluated in context. Alternative routes to acceptable evaluation for teachers.
I guess I would add one other thing, which is that we've talked about the alternative to value-added type estimates being letting the principal be in charge. But I think it's unrealistic for the principal to be actually the person doing this. Principal's got 30 or 40 teachers and has a lot of other responsibilities other than teacher evaluation. And so one important, I think, safeguard is to make sure that there are real resources available to do this job. You can't expect somebody to evaluate well in a couple of hours a week. So the person doing it needs to be trained, and they need to have time to do it.
In this lady?
Well, going to go with Education Daily, he kind of stole my question. But I'm wondering, are there examples, I know, Linda, you mentioned TAP, that do a good job of doing the kind of things you were talking about, being nuanced and factoring the student learning at the classroom level, like you said in Singapore, if you have any examples of those.
There are a lot of interesting examples. One of the reasons I mentioned TAP is because they're observations of teachers, which they've surveyed teachers about and teachers find very helpful, are based on this standards-based practice tool. Evaluators are well trained. There's a lot of opportunity for feedback. They have collaborative time for teachers to plan with each other and get professional development and peer observations to improve their practice. All of those things, large numbers of teachers in those systems say it's really helpful to me. Most of the survey data suggests they're less excited about the value-added component of it, but they're willing to tolerate that because it's integrated in with this really good stuff that helps them improve their practice. And so I think that that model of being sure that there's a lot of feedback about practice and evidence of student learning that is integrated is important. Arizona has had a career ladder program for a number of years that has had teachers collecting evidence of student learning as part of what is the evidence presented about their practice. And they've found that as teachers have looked at classroom evidence of what the essays looked like at the beginning of the year and what the essays looked like at the end of the year and what the math knowledge and so on, that they've gotten better at evaluating students. That's improved their practice, and they've produced a lot of good evidence about student learning in the context of the teacher evaluation system that also includes evaluation of practice. In New Mexico, there's a 3-tier career ladder that involves standards-based evaluations of practice that includes student learning evidence that is modeled after the kind of assessment of the national board, but it's done at the beginning of the career, at the point of the professional license, and later on for advancement. So there are a lot of interesting examples of thoughtful evaluation practices going on around the country, and I think it would be helpful to raise those up for further analysis and scrutiny as we try to figure out how to move forward. The point that's been made over and over again, that principals need more training, need more time, need to be augmented in the time they can bring by expert teachers who share some of the load of observing and supporting the improvement of practice is a point that should not get lost here. Because at the end of the day, that's actually the problem that we're trying to solve, is that model has not worked for many, many years.
Well, unfortunately, we have to come to an end, and I know there's a lot of questions, and the panel will be here. So let me, first of all, thank you for your attendance and for your good questions. I think the number of people here shows the interest in the area. I also want to thank the National Academy of Education and AERA for sponsoring this. You picked a very good topic. But lastly, I want to thank the panel because you showed deep knowledge, but you also were able to explain yourself in terms that should have an effect on policy. At least we hope so. So thank you very much.